On today's show, you'll hear investor perspectives on the COVID-19 impact on the cannabis market. This is Investor Perspectives. I'm the host of Investor Connect, Hall T. Martin, where we connect startups and investors for funding. It's the time of COVID-19. Cannabis is currently gaining regulatory approval across the U.S. The lockdown has declared certain sectors, including cannabis, to be an essential service. We have investors and startup founders describe the impact of COVID-19 on the cannabis market. I hope you enjoy this episode. My next guest is David Hess of Trust Capital. So during COVID, what we saw is that some businesses had to stop and others kept running. And so now we have a saying, is your business COVID proof? In other words, can it work in a lockdown? Not only your business, but your customers, suppliers, and your chain, and everything is working and so forth. So in the cannabis space, what does it mean to be COVID proof?
So I've heard the term COVID proof. I like the term, and it's not mine to coin, but others have coined it. I'll repeat it. COVID resistant. Cannabis is certainly COVID resistant. What I caution are ensuring that, cannabis is essential. We know that, but we want to ensure that the SOPs are laid out in such a way that if an essential employee can't make it in for whatever reason, right? That the business can continue without any interruption. And we're finding that more and more important, just as important as the corporate governance itself, are the SOPs. And we're really working with our portfolio companies and frankly with a lot of companies outside our portfolio, because that's in our best interest at Tress, to have a healthier industry and a more sophisticated industry. And so you don't have to be in our portfolio company for us to go ahead and help support you in some areas outside of capital as well. We do that either through Trust Solutions or, just through, just Trust itself. We'll go ahead and make some recommendations for you, if you can't bring on Trust Solutions for whatever reason at the time. But that's what we're doing. We want to do. We want to help. We want companies to really be healthy, right? To really understand their numbers, understand how to execute, and be living in reality.
Right. In the lockdown, we saw many companies shut down because the workers were in quarantine. Meatpacking, for example, was a big issue there. And so going forward, it seems like manufacturing is going to come back to the U.S. and automation is going to come into play to ensure the supply chain. How do you see that impacting cannabis companies? Will there be a shift to automation tools in order to take care of that issue?
Absolutely. Less hands touching the cannabis plant, the better. We're seeing that a lot on the manufacturing side already. There have been a few raises with companies, Bloom Automation being one of them, several others in the industry that have really started turning towards automation. We saw it earlier on in areas like trimming. Companies would start, instead of hand trimming their product, they would go to sort of an auto trimmer. And now that's taken form in really every aspect of the manufacturing process. And you have 10,000 square foot facilities plus, right, up to 100,000 square foot plus. And you can have hundreds of hands on those plants, or just two or three with the help of a fully automated facility, number one. And number two, the data that we're able to glean from those processes is just, it's a whole lot better than when you've got a master grower growing and executing based on their gut. So for a variety of reasons, I think it's going to be more beneficial for everybody involved to be more automated and less hands-on as far as that goes.
My next guest is Marcus Estes of Chromasignate, a technology company in the cannabis space. How does a CBD or a cannabis company COVID-proof their business, given it's such a messy supply chain?
Well, there is no fail-proof answer here except for the hard things. And of course, cash is king. And I think this is a trend that's happening across industries, even later stage tech, where there's a great flight to net profitability. A lot of the larger, more well-funded cannabis companies were caught out over their skates a bit over the past, frankly, few quarters. So what they were doing is they were raising huge sums of capital. They were burning it in an attempt to acquire market share. And all of a sudden, it's musical chairs and whoops, we need net profitability. And some of those groups, you can look at publicly traded companies that have had difficulty with this. They are swiftly refiguring their operations to focus upon net profitability. I would say, again, these are larger companies where some of them being publicly traded, if people are looking to look at public cannabis companies, there's financial information, pour over EBITDA, figure out your story from there. We're looking at privately held companies here, early stage private investments. If that's the focus, I would really just have frank conversations about cash flow. Once a cannabis company hits cash flow profitability, the investment terms become very different, right? So generally speaking, a net positive cash flow cannabis business at a certain volume doesn't have trouble putting hands on capital. So I think a lot of early stage investment, if you're not an experienced investor, you're going to be talking to, if not pre-revenue companies, you're going to be talking to companies that haven't hit that magical green yet. And you're just going to have some very adult conversations about, have you got a good financial model in place? What is your, what sort of unit count do you need at your margins to get there? And make sure that given the money going in, that you can actually literally see that path to profitability. Because I do believe that what that speaks to, of course, the part two of this answer is, learn about the supply chain, as I mentioned earlier, and then have good conversations with, remember, that's your biggest risk externality. If all else goes well, figure out how this company it fits into their supply chain, both upstream and downstream, and try to feel out for risk. Ask them to tell you if this goes wrong, how does it go wrong? And really, if possible, you really want to try to extend your diligence into the supply chain. If you've got a massive bottleneck here and it's a different company, see what you can learn about that company. And I think that's ideally you want to have a good sense of the soundness of that whole, as they say, seed to sale path before you can feel totally de-risked in your due diligence.
My next guest is Narb Alexandrian, a venture capitalist from Canopy Rivers. So in COVID, or just afterwards, many companies were being vetted for being COVID-proof before an investor would put money in. So in the cannabis space, what does it mean to have a startup that is COVID-proof and would potentially survive well in a future lockdown in case that occurs?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, if you look at the industry, it's a hyper-growth industry, similar to how the tech industry looks today. Cannabis, like in any market, you look at California or Canada, it's increasing by about 40 to 200% per year. So it's a large growth rate. Now, to handle that growth rate, companies are burning cash in order to really prop up their top line revenues. That's okay. Even in the COVID phase, that's okay. But companies should be aware that at any given time, something like COVID might come about where you have to take your foot off the gas, especially on the sales and marketing component, and really turn into cash flow positive. So coming out of COVID, I think our lens has, we've been focusing more on how companies, whether in our portfolio or outside of our portfolio, can pivot themselves in any given time and dial down the sales and marketing and turn cash flow positive very quickly. And I'm fortunate enough to say that a lot of our portfolio companies can do that. But now we're looking at other prospective companies the same way to see if their business model actually lets them do that, or are they really, truly just hanging on by a string?
Well, the supply chains turned out to be a big issue in the last lockdown. In particular, you saw that in grocery stores. Food was packaged for restaurants, but not grocery stores. And there would probably be a change in the supply chain to manage that next time. What changes do you see might come up for cannabis as far as supply chain goes?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing on the supply chain side is cultivation is slowly becoming standardized and it's really turning into commodity. I think that really comes into play as breeding programs really mature and the genetics start to stabilize. On the extraction side, we're seeing a commoditization of that as well over a period of time. And extractors are becoming standardized as well. I think the big difference is right now on the processing side. So curing the cannabis, drying the cannabis, and packaging it. There's certain subtleties and differences to standard operating procedures, as well as what some of the best companies do in order to make sure that the product arrives in the freshest possible way to the end consumer. So we're still seeing some plays there. On the cannabis 2.0 or gummy edible function of the market, we are seeing specialization really come into play. So we invested recently into a 27,000 square foot facility called Dynaleo, based out of Alberta province in Canada, that created an automated process to manufacture gummies, white label manufacturing. And their focus on just doing it very, very well is leading them to sign a lot of companies who even currently have products in the market, but are looking to capture more margin by going towards an automated approach. I think it'd be great to touch on globalization. I mean, when you look at cannabis only through the lens of North America, you're really missing out on how globalization can really transform this industry. You have areas like Latin America where you can cultivate outdoor cannabis, THC, that then can be extracted and then sold to other parts of the world once it is legal to do so. And you have areas like China, which have pharmaceutical grade EU GMP facilities for extraction of hemp into CBD. And that can be sold all over the world currently right now through UN conventions. And then you have areas like Europe, which are really coming up about, and you're seeing some of the small cap plays that we saw in North America really repeat themselves in Europe all over again. So it would be difficult to look at North America all by itself, even within the US, just seeing how every state is making up their own laws and how that could just really change all of a sudden as soon as federal legalization takes place, where you would want to cultivate in a dry climate, warm climate like Arizona, and push product out into other states versus doing so in Florida or doing so in New York, where real estate is either more expensive or it's too humid and you get a lot of crop failure due to mold and any bioorganisms there as well. So it's always key to take a step back. And anytime you're making an investment or you're looking at an investment, to say, how does this company survive in 10 years when all of these things start to open up? And if they can't find a way to pivot or change, then people should move on and find something else to invest into.
So as regulatory moves forward and more states open up and more players come into it, it's just going to become a more competitive marketplace, it sounds like.
Absolutely, but there's still a huge blue ocean in front of you. There's about 4 or 5% of the entire country that's being catered to by legal cannabis. There's still a lot of illicit or legacy market to capture. And then there's all the intenders, the older demographic with arthritis that want a cannabis cream to help them out, or pets that are scared of lightning and thunder and want CBD treats to really calm them down. There's still a huge market to be captured. So for anybody in the industry right now who's listening in, my biggest advice would be to look at your competition as cooperatively and then work with them, because there's enough pie right now for everyone to eat.
Thank you for joining us today. As always, be sure to leave a review, subscribe to this podcast, and share it with others. Let's go start up something today. Halti Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for the basis of investment decisions.